Welcome to IIT Social Science Great Problem, Great Minds seminar series this week. So before I introduce today's speaker, I would like you to know you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the webinar. And today's speaker is Professor Yasheng Huang. Professor Yasheng Huang is Epoch Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management and Faculty Director of Action Learning at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Before he served as an Associate Dean in charge of Global Partnership Programs and its Action Learning Initiative. At MIT Sloan School, Professor Huang founded and runs China labs and the Indian lab, providing consulting services to small and medium enterprises in China and India. And Professor Huang is the author of 11 books in both English and Chinese, and numerous academic papers and news commentaries. He is currently a co-PI in a large-scale cross-disciplinary research project on food safety in China. His current book is On the Rise and the Fall of Technologies in Ancient and Contemporary China. Today he will talk about a chapter in this new book he's writing, The Rise of the East Again. He has held or received prestigious fellowships such as National Fellowship at Stanford University and the Social Science Research Council MacArthur Fellowship. National Asian research programs named him one of the most outstanding scholars in the United States, conducting research on issues of policy importance to the United States. He has served as a consultant at World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development, and serves on advisory and corporate boards of nonprofit and for-profit organizations. So I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Huang to give the talk.
Thank you very much, Hao. Thank you for inviting me. And so I'm going to present one chapter of my book, and it's quite understandable because I am just presenting one chapter. I hope to also convey to you the ideas of the whole book, but I'm just going to focus on the technology. I have two chapters on technology, one on historical period, one on the contemporary period, and today I'm going to focus on the historical period. So it's the book is The Rise of the East Again. It has been accepted by two academic presses, and I'm trying to decide which one I'm going to go with. But still, this is preliminary, and if you have comments, feedback, criticisms, just feel free to stop me anytime that you want. I'm very used to being interrupted and then have a conversation, right? So please feel free. So how you're going to monitor the discussion, right? So anybody who wants to ask a question and disagree with me, please just feel free to do so. Okay. All right. So the title is the Needham question, and maybe not everybody is familiar with Needham. Needham is Joseph Needham, and he was a biochemist by training, but he's more famous for writing about Chinese science and technology. He and his students and collaborators compiled 27 volumes on science and civilization in China. And then in this book, he published in 1969, The Grand Treatise. He asked kind of two related questions. One is that how come China failed to develop science? And the second question is, how come China had this incredible leadership in technology, but then it failed to launch its own industrialization, right? In his mind, these two questions are actually connected, because his argument is that China failed to launch its own industrial revolution because it didn't develop science, right? So that's pretty much how he answered his own question. And so this is known as a Needham question, and there's just a lot of literature as a result of that question. And so my chapter, my book is part of the effort to find the answer to the Needham question. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to first begin with a preview of the results and the main contributions. And then I'm going to introduce sort of different theories to answer the Needham question. And then I'm going to introduce our data set, Chinese historical invention data set, and then the measure of Chinese inventions. I think this is the most unique part of sort of my contribution, because previously the literature didn't really have any data. It's more like historical speculations and narrations, but there's really no data to draw upon, right? Whereas for the first time, at least as far as I know, now we have some data to answer that question. And then I'm going to present the findings. The key thing is to look at breaks in the data, the discontinuities in the data, when the trajectory of Chinese science and technology change and the timing of that change. That's the key part of the data analytics. And then I'm going to introduce this perspective on Needham question, which I think is the best explanation, contestability hypothesis. Of all the hypotheses, I think this is probably the best. And I'm going to use the data to illustrate that hypothesis. I don't think I will have time because I only have 1 hour. But if I do have time, I'm going to talk about extensions of the findings and unpacking the mechanism. And then I'm going to end by drawing broader implications of this way of looking at Chinese technological history. Okay. So let me get to the first part, preview the results. The results are Chinese inventiveness peaked much earlier than I think what many historians have believed. Right? Most people say that China began to stagnate around kind of 13th century, 14th century. Our data show actually Chinese began to decline in 6th century. And there's a second decline, 13th century, 14th century, but that's a second decline, not the first one. Right? So just kind of empirically, the results are actually quite interesting because it sort of says something that we didn't know before we have the data. And these two waves of decline match closely in timing with the end of the political fragmentation and the rise of political unification and the collapse of ideological competition. Right? So I mean, if I can sort of put it very simplistically, Chinese inventions ended when China became more authoritarian, right? Politically and ideologically. Right? And that happened in the 6th century. So our findings are consistent with the contestability perspective on technology. And Joe Mulcair from Northwestern University is probably one of the most prominent proponents of this idea. And I think my research supports his interpretation of technology. And then I think there are important implications for China today. As China now is moving more in the direction of authoritarian direction, my own view is that this is not going to be good for technology and for science. So the main contributions, I believe, on my part are, I have a more empirical approach, data-driven approach, as opposed to just kind of discussions and debates of different ideas and narratives. And also, I kind of reframe the whole question from a cross-sectional angle to a time series angle. So most of this discussion is about why China is different from Europe, right? The difference between Europe and China. My analysis focuses on the difference between China before 6th century and China after 6th century. So it's a time series research design as opposed to a cross-sectional research design. And I think this is a cleaner setting to look at some of the explanations proposed to answer the Needham question, because by doing this, you hold country fixed effects constant, right? And then you could look at the things that vary over time. I also believe that it is a kind of a better way to draw policy implications, because there are people who feel that Western lessons are not appropriate to China. Europe is Europe, and China is different. I am actually drawing from Chinese own history and formulate my policy implications. So it doesn't have this kind of a baggage of kind of Western values and that kind of thing. So anytime you want to stop me, please do so. And this is the first draft, and this is the second presentation that I'm making on this topic. So I welcome any suggestions about alternative interpretations, about literature and different perspectives. Okay, so let me talk about the Needham question, the debates. There's just a massive literature, and but you can kind of break down the literature into kind of these categories. One blames the Chinese failure to launch industrial revolution on Chinese culture and Chinese cognitions, right? The other one blames on Chinese technology, agricultural technology. Stifling bureaucracy is another idea. Chinese failure in science. This is pretty much Needham's own answer to his question. And economists tend to emphasize trade, commerce, right? Closing to the trade, closing to the commerce, and this is kind of more or less Ming Dynasty phenomenon. Some of you may know that there was a famous voyage by Zheng He, and Qing Dynasty stopped the voyage. And a lot of economists believe that that was the reason why China didn't develop. And then Justin Lin wrote a paper in 2008 talking about the crowding out effect of imperial civil service examination as a factor. And then another view is actually that China never declined. China's kind of developed like this. It's just that the West taking off, right? The West took off. China didn't really decline. And then the last one is contestability. So these are, very, very different hypotheses. They're kind of connected with each other, but they're very, very different. So they're all plausible, but the problem is that without data, you can't really sort them out. You can't really say one is more plausible than the other. So the debate is never really resolved. And I don't think there's kind of this active debate going on because people can't really come together and look at the same facts and then make decisions because of the lack of data set, right? Lack of data. So this is where our project comes in, and I've been doing this for 6 years, and finally the project is far along for me to do analysis. So we use 2 source materials. One is Needham's SCC, the Science and Civilization in China. The other is a project by the Chinese Academy of Natural Sciences, the history of Chinese science and technology. So we use both of these materials to digitize the information in these volumes. It is a massive amount of work because the information is not presented very systematically. It's kind of a free-form text style. So everything has to be done manually. I wish I could tell you that we're using some fancy MIT technology there. We're not. We're just using labor. And at Tsinghua University, we hired 44 researchers. At MIT, we hired 10 researchers to do this. So it took me 6 years to do this. So this is kind of 2 examples of how we did it, right? So our research assistant would read the whole thing, and then write down the inventions and the date. So in this case, it is the discovery of magnetic power, and then it is attributed to the 3rd century, between 3rd century and 6th century BCE, right? And this is glass beads, right? And it's either Han Dynasty or Qin Dynasty, right? CHIN, that's the old spelling of Qin. So as you can see that, sometimes it's not clear whether or not it can be assigned to one dynasty. So we have all sorts of ways of assigning the data to these dynasties and check for consistency. The inventions are defined in a way that Needham defined them. And they refer to, it can refer to discovery, right, of a scientific principle, right, mathematical principle that's counted as an invention, or technical gadget, or scientific theory, or production method, right, a new irrigation method. So as you can see, I use inventions in a very broad way. And the reason is very simple, because I can't really tell from the information that they have provided whether that's actually science rather than technology. And in the ancient times, it's not even clear that the distinction is not that straightforward. So I use these words interchangeably. And so people who study innovation will say, oh, these are all different concepts. But I have no choice. I don't have the detailed information. So I use science and technology interchangeably. I use inventions and innovations interchangeably. The data set is appropriate for comparing China with itself, right? Different dynasties and different time periods. It is really not appropriate to compare China with Europe, for example, because the definitions of inventions are not uniform. Right? So let me drink some water, but if people have questions, I'll be happy to answer. Just sip of water. Okay, so let me introduce our measurement, right? The measure of inventiveness. It's a very simple measure. It is the number of inventions divided by the population of that dynasty, right? So Ming Dynasty will be the number of inventions during the Ming Dynasty divided by the population of the Ming Dynasty. That's easier said than done, by the way, because we are talking about ancient times, we are talking about history, and there are many estimates of populations, right? And I'll be happy to explain this, but I'm using Professor Ge Jianxiong from Fudan University. I'm using his estimates, but I'm also checking the calculation against the estimates by other historians to make sure our results are not influenced by the choice of this particular scholar. And it turns out that there are some differences, but it turns out those differences don't matter for the question that I try to answer. There are objections to this measure, and let me skip those, but if people are interested in, I'll be happy to come back. One is that different dynasties have different length, right? Some dynasties long, some dynasties short. I have an answer to that. And the other is that when you scale the inventions by population, obviously some dynasties have more population, and other dynasties have a smaller population. So the larger dynasties will show lower ratio, right? I have answered to that. I don't think that's a legitimate objection, but I'll be happy to talk about that. And the other is population density, right? So let me talk about the findings. And the key thing is to identify changes in the patterns of the data. That's the key analytical and empirical focus, right? So this is the raw number, just the number of inventions. This is the Qing Dynasty. So the number one by this measure is a Song Dynasty with 1,400 inventions, and then the Han Dynasty, Qing Han. I sort of put them together because Qing is too short. Qing Han is the second. The third is the Ming Dynasty. The fourth is Qing Dynasty. And the fifth is the Tang Dynasty. So this kind of absolute metric has been used by some Chinese scholars to look at the evolution of Chinese science and technology. They don't have the kind of data that I have, that we created. They may have like 100 inventions, and then they plot these inventions over Chinese history. But they only look at the absolute number. That's a problem, right? And as you can see from this graph, Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, by this measure, are more inventive than the Tang Dynasty. For anybody who is familiar with history, you would argue that this is just that doesn't make any sense. Tang Dynasty is one of the most inventive, innovative dynasties in Chinese history, and Qing Dynasty is not known for innovativeness. Ming Dynasty is not known for innovativeness, right? So if you have a metric that shows that's so kind of different from historical consensus, then the metric is probably not correct, right? And the reason is very simple, because Qing Dynasty and Ming Dynasty, they have a very large population, right? Ming Dynasty has over 100 million people, and Qing Dynasty toward the end had something like 300 million people, and Tang Dynasty only had 47, right? So you have so many people sort of potentially doing inventive work, and you can't really compare just the absolute number. It is like comparing the patents by Russia, the absolute number of patents by Russia, with the absolute number of patents by Singapore. You know, Russia has more patents than Singapore, and then draw the conclusion Russia is more inventive than Singapore. That clearly is wrong, because Russia has such a large population. So we got to scale the inventions by population, and this is the picture that we get, right? And this is the peak of Chinese inventiveness is during this period. This is between 220 and 580. This is known as, in Chinese, this is known as the Three Kingdoms, Wei Jin, and it's known as Wei Jin, Southern and Northern dynasties, Wei Jin, Nan Bei Chao. That includes the Three Kingdom period, right? 三国演义, Three Kingdom period. And that's the peak, has the highest score, CDI score. And the second peak is this, the Warring States, 战国, Warring States period, right? So again, so the pattern here is very striking. So you can see that there are kind of three periods in Chinese history, and this is the highest, this period, right? This period is the highest, and then it declined during this period, right? During this period, and then there's a further decline during this period, right? So the Chinese decline began in the 6th century, rather than in the sort of 14th, 15th century, as most historians believe, right? And so there is a decline around this period. Definitely there's a sort of 14th, 15th century decline, but that's the second decline. This is the first decline, right? And that's actually a bigger decline, because the CDI score is reduced almost by half during the first wave of decline. And the second wave, the CDI score is reduced probably by 1/3, right? So the bigger decline is during the first period, is during the Sui Dynasty period, right? So that to me is the period that we need to pay attention to. Again, are there any questions? Are there any disagreements? And
hi, sir. I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Is it possible that although the CDI score was decreasing over time, that the inventions could carry a bigger meaning or a bigger purpose?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and let me say sort of. Let me give you two responses. One is yes, and the other is I don't know. Okay, so let me give you the yes response. First, it is absolutely true that Song Dynasty, which is during this second period of decline, is known for inventing really significant inventions. 3 out of the 4 big inventions that China is known for, gunpowder, compass, and printing, they were invented during the Song Dynasty, right? So your intuition is right, but only about Song, because you can't. I mean, at least I don't know other inventions during Tang or during Ming or during Qing that are so significant, and then we can sort of say, oh, okay, they invented fewer things, but those are more significant. The only statement we can make about that is the Song Dynasty, right? Not about any other dynasties. The other I don't know part is well, actually, I do know. The other part is the only kind of example I can think of that sort of invents significant things, but not really a lot of them, is Soviet Union. Right, is Soviet Union. But there's something wrong with that, right? So, and there's an excellent book by my colleague at MIT. It's called The Lonely Ideas, right? Soviet Union actually invented lots of things, but Soviet Union never made any money from it, and so normally what you ought to see is clustering. So in the West, right, I think everybody, at MIT and IIT should familiar with this curve. If you look at the Western inventions, right, so usually it's like this, and then after 18th century, it goes up like this, right? Because more inventions kind of feed each other, and it's cumulative, combinatorial, and exponential, right? So to some extent, it's really the number that's more important than how significant the individual inventions are, because that will give you need the big numbers to get this pattern, right? And that will give you like economic growth, GDP growth, and technology and things like that. Okay, good question. Thank you. Yeah. Are there other questions? There's something in the chat, but the problem is my screen is not very perfect. I don't really see the.
Yeah, I think Euro have questions. So
okay.
Our faculty Euro. So Euro, his question is, instead of standardizing by population, could we divide by the economically active working population if the data are available?
Well, I think that will be a good idea, but there's just simply no data are available. Maybe that kind of data can be available for one dynasty, but we need basically all the dynasty data to do this calculation, right? So just to calculate the ratio for one dynasty, it's just not that useful. Yeah, so I mean, that's the problem, right? So we're dealing with the historical data, and China, compared with Europe, has very complete population data, and that's the best that we can do. Going back to 400 BCE, we still have some population estimate. That's actually very impressive. So yes, I love to do that, but I just cannot. Right? Are there other questions?
Ting, would you speak?
Thank you very much. Yeah, Dr. Huang, very interesting analysis. I'm kind of curious, maybe I missed it somehow earlier. The CDI score, is that possible standardized by year? Because as you mentioned, each dynasty different length, right?
Yeah, very good suggestion, and I've done that. Well, it's scaled both by population and by year, right? So rather than just by year, because different dynasties have very, very different sizes of the population. So
yeah, I mean by both, yes.
Yeah, by both. So this is scaled by both, and so CDI score scaled by dynasty duration. There are some differences with the previous graph, but the main patterns are preserved, right? So it's the main pattern that I care about. It's not the individual differences. The main patterns are you have the highest inventive period during this part of the history, right? And so this is also Sui Dynasty, right? Until Sui Dynasty. And then you have the second, and then you have the third, right? So it's the same pattern. The reason why I prefer, it's a mess now, but the reason why I prefer this score to that score is this score gives you some kind of nonsensical patterns, right? One of which is if you look at if you look at Yuan Dynasty, this is Yuan Dynasty here, right? And then look at the Tang Dynasty. Tang Dynasty is here, and then this is Han Dynasty. It will tell you that Yuan, Han, and Tang dynasties are about the same. That just, that just doesn't make any sense, right? So Yuan Dynasty is known as the least inventive dynasty, and it is not known as having invented, really significant things, right? So I kind of use, I use some historical knowledge to judge which metric makes most sense, right? And because of this kind of pattern that is so inconsistent with our historical knowledge, I think this measure is probably not as good as the previous measure. But the other thing is, if you think about this, right? So inventions divided by population, right? If you think about this equation, the larger populations, which dynasties tend to have larger population? It's the longer dynasties, right? Ming Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, and the Qing Dynasty. And the reason is very simple, because long dynasties are more peaceful. When you have peace, then population can grow. So when you scaled inventions by population, you are already partially taking into account the length of the dynasties, right? So that's, to me, that's kind of a conceptual way to think about the CDI score. I think it's a better score because conceptually it incorporates the population for sure, but also indirectly the length of the dynasties. And then it gives you patterns that kind of make sense, right? Kind of make the historical sense, right? So that's why in my book, I showed this graph, but I'm mostly going to focus on the CDI score. Okay, very, very good suggestion. Are there other questions in the queue? Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is population density. I mean, all I can say is population density doesn't really affect inventions. Okay, so this is the three eras of Chinese technology, right? The earlier era, the middle era, and the late era, right? And that's the pattern that we established in the previous graphs. So the key question is, what happened here? What happened in the 6th century? What was China before 6th century, and what was China after the 6th century? So that's the period I focus on. And we come to the contestability perspectives when we focus on that period. But before we do that, I want to say that the pattern that we have established in the graphs already help us to rule out some of the hypotheses, right? As you may remember what I said before, there are a lot of ideas trying to answer the Needham question, but there's no kind of resolution, right? With this kind of data, I'm not saying this is the final answer, but with this kind of data, we're actually beginning to be able to say, oh, this explanation doesn't make any sense, right? At least we may not establish the right explanation, but we can kind of rule out the wrong explanation. Just look at the trade explanation, right? China began to close itself to trade in the 14th century. Well, okay, that may explain the second wave. It definitely doesn't explain 6th century, right? So we can kind of rule out that explanation, at least as the one that can explain the first decline. The other idea is that China was very close to Industrial Revolution because they're looking at 14th century, 15th century, and they're looking at the decisions by the emperors to stop the voyage explorations, right? A lot of economists believe that because of that, China lost the chance to join the world in technology. Well, but if China began to decline in the 6th century, I mean, that decision may be important, but that's kind of that's of a second order effect, right? It may have made the first wave more problematic, but it didn't start the decline, right? The dominance of agricultural technology, well, now we have data, right? In our data set, we have about close to 11,000 Chinese inventions. Only 300 of them are in agriculture. So this whole idea that China specializes in agricultural inventions, that's just not true. It's just not supported by data. But these are the kind of questions you can't even begin to answer without data. Okay, so I already went through this in the previous slide, but I want to come to this last bullet point. So there's an idea that China never declined. It's just that the West took off, right? Europe took off in 17th century, 18th century. As you remember, clearly that's not true, right? So the pattern is this. China clearly declined, right? So it's really not true that China didn't decline and the West took off. I mean, what happened is that China went like this, the West went like that, right? So the gap is actually very, very big, rather than China went like this, the West went like that, okay? Okay, so let's come to the contestability idea. And this is an idea formulated mostly to explain Europe. So the idea is that after the Roman Empire, Europe was divided politically, ideologically, religiously, a political fragmentation, right? And Joe Mokyr used the contrast between Christopher Columbus and Zheng He to illustrate the difference between China and Europe, right? So you may remember what happened to Christopher Columbus. He sailed to America, but he was lobbying different European kings for money to fund his voyage, right? Whereas in China, Zheng He had one backer, the Emperor of China. Once that emperor changed his mind, well, in this case, he died, and the new emperor didn't want to continue, then he had no money. Whereas in Europe, you can go to different countries, different kings, and if one king said no, you can lobby another one, right? So this is what happened. Portuguese told him to go away. British told him to go away. French told him to go away, and then he got the money from Spain, right? Whereas in China, you cannot do that, right? So that's more that competitive environment is good for technology. It's good for scientific development. Okay, so I only have like less than 7 minutes. So let me just show you what happened during this period, right? Using the data that we have. Okay, so there's a very good book called The Escape from Rome, and the argument of that book is that the reason why today we have technology, we have science, we have GDP, is because of the collapse of Roman Empire. It gave rise to a divided Europe, fragmented Europe, and therefore there's political competition, economic competition. Between 220 and 580, China was very much like Europe. There was political fragmentation for 360 years. There were multiple ideologies and religions. There was abstract thinking and metaphysical thinking. Two most prominent pure mathematicians lived in that era, right? Liu Hui and Zhu Chongzhi. Intellectuals were kind of independent from the state, more independent from the state than intellectuals in other eras of Chinese history, right? So that was a period of kind of political competition, economic competition, intellectual competition, right? Do we have data to show that? Actually, we do. So this is the number of political and territorial units. Look at this period, right? This period. This is the total number of political and territorial units that existed during that period. 29. As compared with 1 during Sui, and then all this during Sui. And then there was another rise of political fragmentation during the 10th century, right? Like 15 political units, right? But there's no question that this period was most politically fragmented in Chinese history. Let me skip that, right? And then there's also evidence of ideological fragmentation, ideological competition. This is from a different data set. This is the share of Chinese religions, right? Taoism and Buddhism, of the total number of intellectuals, right? This is the that period, right? It is now the second highest, not the highest. The highest is the Tang Dynasty, right? In terms of the share of the Buddhist population. And then what happened is during the Song Dynasty, the share collapsed, right? We actually have 2 other additional measures. They all tell you exactly the same thing. Beginning in 10th century, China began to have one idea, Confucianism, dominating everything else, right? So essentially, ideological contestability went down to 0, right? So I would argue that the first wave of technological decline was because of the political unification. The second wave of technological decline was because of ideological unification, right? So exactly the opposite from what happened in Europe when Europe began to have different ideas, different political units. So the basic takeaway of this is lack of political diversity, ideological diversity, is bad for inventions. Okay, so this is a different measure. They all show you the same thing. This is the peak. Right? And this is by Chinese academics. They show you that the dominance of Confucianism during the Song Dynasty, 71%, as compared with 36% and 40% before, right? So actually, these data are actually quite interesting. They kind of tell you the same thing. Song is a little bit of an anomaly, right? A new file was asking about significant inventions. I don't think I have a very good explanation for Song for not having the political fragmentation as well as ideological fragmentation, but still quite inventive. I think the economics probably explains some of that, but that's not something that I really have very good data on, but that's my intuition, right? So let me, I only have 2 minutes, and let me conclude. As you can see, I actually have quite a bit. So conclude on one note about the contemporary period. So the chapter that I presented to you is about history. I have another chapter about contemporary Chinese technology. And my conclusion there is that the Chinese contemporary success is both because of the strong power of the government, as well as because of contestability conditions, right? And what are the contestability conditions? We're talking about, for example, foreign direct investments, research collaborations with Western universities, autonomy of Hong Kong, and private sector development, right? All these are kind of contestability conditions. The problem now is that these contestability conditions are being undermined under the current leadership. So I kind of worry about technological development in China. Let me just end there. And I see there's one comment in the note. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank Professor Tang's very interesting and insightful talk. So I think in the comments we have questions from Jeff. Then his question is, does that imply that globalization is bad for innovation?
No, not at all, right? So as I said before, the trade restrictions in the 14th century may explain the second wave of decline, right? So this is the kind of my interpretation of what happened in the Ming Dynasty. The problem with the current explanation is that they think that the Chinese began to decline in 14th century, whereas my data show that China began to decline in the 6th century. So if you just focus on globalization or anti-globalization, you cannot explain the first decline, right? And the globalization. So I'm actually saying exactly the opposite from you. Globalization is good for innovations, is good for inventions. Ming decided to go against globalization, and therefore there was a second decline, but that's not the first decline, right? And then there's another question. So political and ideological unification was bad for innovation. Yes. Oh, good. Sorry, I might have. Okay, so I didn't have time to talk about the positive role of the state because I ran out of the time. In my slides, I have data to show that a lot of Chinese scientists and technologists in history were government employees. So the support by the state was critical to the success of Chinese science and technology in the early period. My argument throughout the book is that economic success, technological success requires two things. One is support from the government, and the other is government kind of letting go of the scientists, giving them space, giving them freedom, giving them intellectual freedom, cognitive freedom, right? So sometimes it's hard to get them the combination right? But you need both. What happened in China after the 6th century was they still had the government support, right? The whole Zheng He voyage was massive, and that was all government support. You still have government support, but you lose the intellectual freedom, you lose the cognitive freedom, and therefore the inventions began to decline. So sometimes, and in China today, right? You also have this kind of combination of two things. One is the scale, but support by the government, and the other is giving you enough freedom. And sometimes it's hard to strike the right balance between the two. Okay, very.
I think the team also have the questions. Do you think the invention measure is much focused on agriculture and military technology innovation, but not on other industries? That could be part of the reason where other industries start to rise. What is achieved in the efficient record are limited or given emphasis on agriculture and military only?
Yeah, so as I said before, I just don't see it in the data, right? So as I said before, there are about 300 agricultural inventions. Our total data set has 11,000 inventions. So it's just simply not true that the Chinese inventions were dominated by agricultural inventions. We didn't really look at the military because military that's more about the applications rather than about the technology itself. So we don't really have a way to say how many military technologies, how many military inventions they are. Whether or not it is biased by official records, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you one way or the other, but that's the best we can do. What's important is it doesn't actually matter whether or not there are biases. Even if there are biases, as long as these biases are consistent across different dynasties, then it doesn't affect our analysis, right? What you don't want is sometimes the dynasties are biased in one way and other dynasties are biased in the other way. Then the analysis is problematic, right? So, but we have no reason to believe that dynasties systematically differ in terms of the directions of the biases. Okay, I think there's another.
Yeah, Jeff asked, how can one codify where that balance of scientific freedom should be?
I don't know. I don't know how to quantify that. And so I kind of this is like doing social science modeling work, right? So you can specify optimal solution, but you actually cannot construct one. My point is that the kind of going in either direction is not the right way to think about this, right? So you have to have both. I mean, if you look at the United States, by the way, you can say that United States, I mean, a lot of Republicans will say that, right? Republicans will say, oh, United States succeeded because of free enterprise or because of freedom and liberty. Well, Yeah, yes and no, right? So government funding of science, government funding of basic research, right? That's a critical piece of success of the United States as a technological scientific power. If you take away the government support, I'm not sure all the freedom in the world can give you this kind of success. But on the other hand, we also have the opposite example, right? Only government support without the intellectual freedom, then you don't really have the success as well. So exactly where the balance is, I don't really know, right? So, but conceptually, I think we need to have both. We need to have a balanced approach.
Then just to follow this question, do you think what's the difference between the historical Chinese technology balance between scale of the government scale of technology and the electronic freedom and compared to contemporary China's?
Yeah. So I would say that China before 6th century was much more free than China today, like by far, much more free. And so the intellectual freedom then was substantial. Although you could make an argument in China today, the freedom enjoyed by the scientists is actually a lot. The freedom enjoyed by the social scientists is very little, right? So Chinese government picks and chooses what kind of freedom they allow, right? I mean, you can argue that Chinese scientists have more freedom than scientists in the United States. Look at the CRISPR research in China, right? He Jiankun, he genetically edited babies. I mean, there's no way you can do that in the United States, right? Of course, then he was sentenced to jail. The big data, right? There are fewer privacy concerns in China, so you can do more facial recognition in China than you can in the United States. So to some extent, technologists and scientists in China have more freedom than technologists and scientists in the United States. But United States has, people like me. I'm a social scientist, right? I have freedom, and I can criticize U.S. government or I can criticize Chinese government. Whereas in China, the social scientists, the lawyers, the journalists, they don't have freedom, and I think that's problematic. That's problematic. What I showed in the data is that between 220 and 580, not only did Chinese technology take off, Chinese humanities also reached the peak, right? So the humanities, right, 人文, 文学, also reached the peak. So you actually need both.
So then, what do you think is the reason cause China's freedom in the social sciences become more restricted than before?
Well, I mean that's political rule, right? So it's Communist Party political rule, and are you talking about history? I mean, if history.
I mean, evolutionary.
Well, in history, what happened was the country got unified, and my book is not just about technology; it's also about political evolution. Mm-hmm. The country got unified in 580, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that Sui Dynasty invented civil service examination system. It was that civil service examination system that led to the dominance of one ideology, Confucianism, and at the expense of Buddhism, legalism, and Taoism, and everything else, right? So it was a civil service examination system that that led to the ideological conformity, right? Unfortunately, I have to leave in 5 minutes, but
Okay.
are there
Yeah, it's other
Could
questions.
I just say one thing regarding the CRISPR example? I think it's important to note that there was backlash for those research efforts.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it wasn't. I mean, when we say that they're on the frontier, they're operating with relative freedom. It means that they're operating as though they were pirates, where they're just engaging in potentially illegal, ethically violating behavior. And they did get called on that. And there was a reining in of those efforts. I just wanted to highlight that point.
Yeah, no, I think, Matthew, you're absolutely right. I don't mean to give the impression that it was condoned. It was, the scientist was sentenced to jail. There are actually different accounts of exactly what happened. One account was that the hospital approved the procedure. I cannot imagine the hospital, he could have done that without the authorization from the hospital, because he did it in the hospital. Whereas, so you I mean, obviously he believed that he would not go to jail, otherwise he would not have done it, right? So, I mean, at least in the United States, there is no way that you can get this kind of approval beforehand. So it's not like I go ahead and do it and then suffer the consequences. It would not have been approved in the first place, right? I mean, every year I have to do this conflict of interest and human subject things, and and I would argue, and Steven Pinker from Harvard actually said this, in the West, we impose too many restrictions on scientists. It's a pain in the neck. You spend all this time filling out the forms, and now with the Chinese scientists being monitored by the FBI, all the disclosure requirements are becoming extremely complicated, right? So there are a lot of restrictions on scientists in the United States. Maybe the last question.
The last question. New four. Do you want to ask?
It's very quick as a question. I have a feeling that China has experiencing a cycle of decrease in innovation and increase in innovation. And currently, you said that you have a feeling that China's future is not so bright. But is there a chance that this not so bright future might have another cycle of increase in innovation?
Well, the cycle doesn't happen automatically, right? So if we have to think about science and technology in a broader social, political, economic context, and what goes down does not automatically comes up. I mean, China didn't, right? So beginning in the 6th century, it went down. It didn't really come back until pretty much 1980s, right? I would argue, and so it's not automatic that it will come back. The question here is that it's ultimately about politics, right? So and I, for the short run, I don't see any space that the politics is going to come back. I mean, China. I wrote about this in my previous books. China actually was going through a liberal period before, and this is the most illiberal moment in the Chinese recent history.
Currently, you can see that, for example, Alibaba is having a lot of hard time with the Chinese government, as well as Ant. and we can see the impact that it had on, like, investment, foreign investment inside of China. So it doesn't feel like foreign investors really want to pour their money anymore in China.
Yeah, I know. So if you look at Alibaba, if you look at Tencent, if you look at Baidu, if you look at all these high-tech companies, they were not backed by the Chinese capital. They were backed by foreign capital, right? The venture capitalists from the United States, from Japan, and so restricting foreign capital, and now the foreign capital, they may go into real estate and stock market, but I don't think SoftBank has announced they are suspending their investments in China, right? And under the current environment, I don't see any kind of VC type of capital going to China because there are just too many uncertainties. Okay, I have to run though.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. So I think we just usually applause for your excellent talks. Thank you so
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was working yesterday night on the seminar, and my question is, when we write the essays on seminar, is it like one page only, or like recto verso type of page?
Just a one page, half, I think double space. So I think I will upload an example response paper, so you can refer to that response paper on Blackboard.
Like, because, for example, I watched another seminar from the nuclear, but I'm gonna watch the one that you've uploaded on, and for example, she was saying things that I would agree, but also saying things that I think was more open to more, dialogue or more discussion. For example, like working out on receiving funds from Europe, and I don't know if like I could, if I should write this down, like if I think that she could, for example, work